You grew up next to someone, maybe a cousin, maybe a childhood friend and sister who slept over so many times with you as they basically lived in same house. And at some point, without anyone teaching you the rule, your brain quietly filed them under a category. Not that category. You never had to think about it. It just happened. But the real answer for why that happened is far stranger than you think. It has nothing to do with morality classes or religious commandments or a village elder standing up one day and announcing a new law. It goes back further than agriculture. Further than language, maybe. It is written into the architecture of your brain, and it took scientists over a century to prove it was there. So when did ancient humans actually figure this out? Not when did they write it down, when did they feel it? Start with the obvious question. Why would this even be a problem? Your body is a machine built from instructions. 2 sets, 1 from each parent. Most of the mistakes in those instructions are hidden because you have a backup copy. If one copy has a typo, the other copy usually covers for it. Here is the problem. Close relatives share more of the same instructions. So when 2 closely related people have children, the odds that both copies carry the same mistake go up, way up. The backup system starts failing. Geneticists call this inbreeding depression, and the numbers are not subtle. Studies across human populations show that children of first-degree relatives face a dramatically higher risk of genetic disorders, stillbirth, and early death, compared to children of unrelated parents. Some estimates put the increased mortality risk at 2 to 3 times higher. Nature does not care about laws. Nature cares about outcomes. And for hundreds of thousands of years, inbreeding was one of the worst outcomes a small hunter-gatherer band could produce. So evolution did something clever. It did not wait for humans to understand genetics. It built the aversion in before anyone had a word for DNA. This is where a Finnish sociologist named Westermarck comes in. In 1891, he proposed something that sounded almost too simple. He said that children who are raised together very early in life, especially before the age of 6, develop an automatic sexual aversion to each other later on, not because someone taught them incest is wrong. Because proximity itself, at that critical age, flips a switch. The people you grow up next to get quietly reclassified in your mind, not potential partners, family, even if they are not related to you at all. For decades, people dismissed this idea. It felt too neat, too convenient. Sigmund Freud was arguing the opposite at the time, that incestuous desire was actually the default state, repressed by culture, not blocked by biology. For a while, Freud's version won the argument, simply because it was louder. Then came the kibbutz. In the mid-20th century, Israeli kibbutzim raised children communally. Kids from different families, often completely unrelated, were placed in the same children's houses from infancy. They ate together, slept in the same rooms, bathed together, grew up practically as siblings, sometimes for over a decade. A sociologist named Joseph Schepper studied thousands of marriages between people who had grown up on these kibbutzim. If Freud was right, some of these childhood companions should have paired off. Proximity, after all, usually breeds romance. Out of nearly 3,000 marriages he examined, do you know how many were between 2 people raised together in the same peer group from birth? 0. Not low, not rare, 0. Schepper found something even stranger. Almost none of these peers even reported sexual attraction to each other as adults, despite years spent as close as any biological siblings. They described it again and again, using the same word, like a brother, like a sister. Westermarck had been right the entire time. The mechanism was not cultural. It was not a rule someone handed down. It was a switch that got flipped by early, sustained childhood proximity, regardless of actual blood relation. Here is where it gets even stranger. This same pattern shows up on the other side of the world, in a completely different context, proving it was not a fluke of one Israeli experiment. In Taiwan, there was once a tradition called simpua marriage, or minor marriage. Families would adopt a baby girl and raise her from infancy alongside the boy she was destined to marry. They grew up in the same household, as close as any siblings, and were formally married once they came of age. An anthropologist named Arthur Wolfe spent decades studying the outcomes of these marriages, using meticulous Japanese colonial household records from the era. The findings mirrored the kibbutz data almost exactly. These arranged simpua marriages had significantly higher divorce rates, fewer children, and higher rates of infidelity compared to marriages between people who met as adults. The couples themselves often described a lack of sexual interest in each other, a kind of emotional flatness neither of them had chosen. 2 cultures, Two totally different centuries and continents. Two completely different social systems. And the exact same biological signal fired in both. Early, sustained childhood proximity kills sexual attraction, whether or not the two people are actually related. Does that surprise you? It should, a little, because it means the aversion you feel is not really about genes at all. It is about a proxy. Evolution could not scan your DNA to check who was safe to pair with, so it used the next best signal available. If you grew up in close contact with someone from a very young age, in the ancestral environment, the odds were extremely high that they were a sibling, a parent, or a close relative. Proximity became a stand-in for blood. This is the twist that changes the entire story. Ancient humans did not need to understand genetics to avoid its dangers. Their bodies were already doing the math for them, using a shortcut written by natural selection over unimaginable spans of time. The aversion came first. The explanation came millennia later. So picture the earliest human bands, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anyone could write a single law. Groups were small, 50 people, maybe 100. Everyone in that band grew up around everyone else. The Westermarck effect would have quietly sorted the group without a single spoken rule. The people you played beside as a toddler simply stopped registering as options once you were grown. Not out of discipline, out of biology. But biology alone is not the whole story. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because once humans developed language, once they could name things, they took a mechanism their bodies had already built and turned it into culture. They made it explicit. They wrote it into myth, into taboo, into law. Nearly every human society that anthropologists have studied has some version of an incest prohibition. The details vary wildly. Some cultures extend the taboo to cousins. Others do not. Ancient Egyptian and Hawaiian royal families famously did the opposite, practicing sibling marriage to preserve bloodline purity and divine status, a striking exception that historians still debate. But the general pattern, avoidance between close blood relatives raised together, shows up again and again, independently, in cultures that never had contact with each other. That independence matters. When you see the same rule appear in isolated societies across every continent, with no shared source, it stops looking like a coincidence of culture and starts looking like something deeper, something biological, dressed up afterward in the language of religion and law. Anthropologists sometimes call this process ritualization. A society takes a pre-existing instinct and gives it ceremony, punishment, and myth, partly to reinforce it in the rare cases where the biological switch does not fire strongly enough on its own. Because the Westermarck effect is powerful, but it is not perfect. It depends heavily on early, continuous, close contact. Siblings separated at birth and reunited as adults do not get the automatic aversion. There is no childhood proximity to trigger it. And there are documented cases of adult reunited siblings feeling intense, confusing attraction toward each other, a phenomenon researchers now call genetic sexual attraction. It is rare. It is not well understood, but it exists precisely because it reveals the mechanism by exception. Remove the proximity, and the switch simply never gets flipped. This tells you something important. The taboo was never really about blood. It was about the signal blood usually sent. And when the signal misfires, in either direction, the underlying instinct misfires with it. Now think about what this means for a psychologist named Deborah Lieberman, who has spent years researching exactly how the brain calculates kinship. Her research suggests the brain runs something like a silent algorithm, weighing cues like how long you cohabited with someone during childhood and whether you watched your mother care for them as an infant. Those two cues alone predict, with remarkable accuracy, how strong a person's incest aversion will be toward a given sibling, whether that sibling is a full biological sibling, a half-sibling, or not related at all. This means your brain is not checking a genetic chart. It is checking a memory, a very old, very quiet memory of who shared your childhood space. So when did ancient humans realize they should not marry their siblings? The realization happened at the level of the species, played out over hundreds of thousands of years of trial and consequence, until the aversion itself became automatic. What ancient humans did realize, later, once language and culture caught up, was that they could name the feeling they already had. They could turn an instinct into a taboo into a law, and a law into a story about gods and punishment. But the story came after the feeling. It always does. This is where the modern mirror comes in, and it might be closer to your own life than you expect, because you have almost certainly felt the Westermarck effect yourself, and never once called it that. That childhood best friend who practically lived at your house? The step-sibling you grew up with from age 4. The neighbor kid you spent every summer with until you were a teenager. If you ever tried to imagine a romantic relationship with any of them, even hypothetically, there is a good chance something in you recoiled a little, a flicker of genuine discomfort that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with a switch flipped decades earlier, one you never consented to and never noticed being thrown. That reaction was not taught to you in a classroom. No one sat you down and explained genetics before you felt it. It arrived fully formed, the same way it arrived in the children of the kibbutz, the same way it failed to arrive in siblings separated since birth. It is one of the oldest pieces of software running quietly in your brain, older than agriculture, older than writing, older possibly than the species you belong to now. Let's go back even further, though, because the Westermarck effect is not unique to humans, and that fact alone should stop you for a second. Look at chimpanzees. Young female chimpanzees, once they reach sexual maturity, almost always leave the group they were born into and migrate to a neighboring community. Researchers who have spent decades observing wild chimpanzee populations have documented this pattern again and again. Sons who remain in their natal troop rarely, if ever, mate with their own mothers, even when both are present, healthy, and surrounded by no social rule preventing it. There is no chimpanzee elder enforcing a taboo. There is no chimpanzee myth about the dangers of shared blood. There is only avoidance, quiet and consistent, generation after generation. Look further still. Many species of birds recognize and avoid mating with siblings they were raised beside, using similar proximity-based cues. Certain rodent species show measurable preferences for unfamiliar mates over familiar litter mates, even when relatedness is experimentally controlled so that unfamiliar and familiar individuals are equally related. Across an enormous range of species, separated by tens of millions of years of evolution, the same basic pattern keeps resurfacing. Proximity during a critical developmental window predicts avoidance later on. This should reframe everything for you, because it means the mechanism did not begin with humans at all. It is not a human invention, not a cultural innovation, not something your ancestors sat around a fire and decided together. It is a solution so effective, so consistently useful for avoiding the costs of inbreeding, that evolution arrived at some version of it independently, over and over, in wildly different branches of the animal kingdom. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the aversion is this old, this deep, this automatic, why does human culture bother legislating it at all? Why write laws against something your own brain already refuses to do? The answer has to do with the size of human social groups and how quickly they changed. For most of human evolutionary history, bands were small and mobile. Everyone grew up around everyone. The Westermarck effect had plenty of raw material to work with. But once humans began settling into larger, denser populations, something shifted. Extended families sometimes lived in separate households. Cousins might grow up in different villages, meeting for the first time as teenagers or adults, well past the critical window the aversion depends on. Wealthy or royal families, in particular, often kept children apart from extended relatives entirely, raised by nurses and tutors rather than alongside cousins and half-siblings. This created a gap, a loophole in the biological safeguard. Two cousins who never shared a childhood household might meet as adults with no automatic aversion between them at all, because the proximity cue that normally does the work of prevention was simply never triggered. In these cases, culture had to step in and do, consciously and explicitly, what biology had failed to do automatically. Laws, religious doctrine, and social taboo became a kind of backup system, patching the exact gap where the Westermarck effect could not reach. This is likely why incest taboos in most societies extend well beyond the people who would actually trigger a strong Westermarck aversion. The rule gets generalized. It becomes about category, not really about lived proximity. Sibling, cousin, in some cultures even distant clan relations, all folded into one prohibited group, regardless of whether those specific individuals ever shared a childhood bedroom. Culture, in a sense, overcorrected, wrapping a much wider net around a much narrower biological signal, just to be safe. There is a darker layer to this story too, one worth sitting with for a moment. Because the existence of an automatic biological aversion tells you something important about the cases where incest still occurs, particularly within families, between an adult and a child who did grow up in close proximity. If the Westermarck effect is as reliable as the kibbutz and simpua data suggest, then something has clearly gone wrong in those cases. Some other force overriding a mechanism that should, by every measure researchers have found, be firing loudly. Psychologists studying these instances point toward power, control, and the deliberate suppression of a child's ability to resist, rather than any failure of an instinctual switch. The instinct is not a moral failsafe on its own. It is a statistical tendency, powerful but not absolute, and understanding it does not excuse the rare and serious cases where it is violently overridden. Now, step back to the bigger picture, the one this video opened with. Somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 years ago, give or take, something like modern human cognition began to take shape. Long before that, though, the aversion was almost certainly already there, inherited from a common ancestor shared with chimpanzees and bonobos, an ancestor that lived roughly 6 to 7 million years in the past. Which means the feeling you have toward the people you grew up beside is not a human invention at all. It is a gift, passed down through an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back long before anything resembling a human walked the earth. Every single one of your direct ancestors, all the way back, avoided this specific danger successfully enough to reproduce. The ones who did not simply are not your ancestors. You are, quite literally, descended from an unbroken line of successful avoidance. Think about that for a second. Every person you have ever met is the end result of hundreds of thousands of generations in a row where this particular switch worked correctly. Not most of the time, every single time in your direct lineage without exception. That is an extraordinary track record for a mechanism nobody ever had to consciously maintain. So here is the real answer to the question this video started with. Ancient humans did not sit around a fire one day and invent the idea that siblings should not marry. The feeling came first, hundreds of thousands of years before the words did, built quietly into the developing brain of every child raised close to another. What ancient humans eventually did, once language gave them the tools, was translate a feeling they had always carried into a story, a rule, a taboo they could teach to the next generation as insurance for the rare cases where proximity alone was not enough. You grew up next to someone, and without anyone teaching you the rule, your brain quietly filed them under a category you never had to think twice about. Now you know why.